welcome to Varn Vlog. And today we are talking with Elijah Emery on the work of Michael Sandel, particularly his critique of meritocracy, which, if those of you who want to peruse a little bit of, I sampled a couple of chapters of back on the beginnings of radical engagements about a year ago now. Michael Joseph Sandel is an American political philosopher at Harvard Law School. He used to have a show on the BBC that I sometimes listen to. He is an old man now, not as old as someone he's often linked with unjustly, good old Lester McIntyre, who's apparently immortal, but Sandel is 70. This book that we're talking about is one of his more recent books. I think it made a splash when it came out. However, it's not one of his main books. So this book came out right before the pandemic. This is The Tyranny of Merit, What Becomes the Common Good. I think he's most famous for Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, which came, I think, out in the 90s, and Democracy's Discontent, which came out in the 90s as well. Although the Democracy's Discontent book has been re-released and updated. And while I use that book for some of my frameworks, for example, he has an interesting framework about the changing meaning of liberal republicanism from like a civic republic into an administrative republic into a moral administrative republic that I find interesting. However, his explanatory praxis for why things went that way is kind of lacking. It's sort of just assumes it's true. That book, though, is where he talks about the whole liberal elite voting patterns. And we're going to start with that before we get into the meritocracy bit, because I wanted to talk to you about this book because it was one of like 4 books that was anti-meritocratic, left, right, and center. They were all over the place. It came out between like 2017 and 2021. There's just a ton of them.
Yeah.
It's a better one, I think. But what was interesting to me is I was going back and reading like the John and Barbara Ehrenreich stuff and the Alvin Gouldner stuff, and I realized that this critique had happened before from a bunch of, let's say, heterodox Marxist and post-Marxist, and then seemingly was put on pause at the end of the 70s and not really picked back up again until recently. Like, yeah, people complain about meritocracy, but this whole like there's a new class of people that's becoming a problem. What's interesting about this book is it is, I put it in the like Venn diagram of books that I don't hate and books about the quote unquote PMC, although he does not use that term.
To his credit.
Yeah, to his credit. He doesn't like try to make this a simple class analysis, but he does kind of,
he focuses on extrapolating a view of cultural politics from whether or not someone is credentialed, which is all he tries to do with that. And it's one reason why the book is, not bad. He's not having some big explanation of the whole of society. He's saying that this is a specific problem within society with a number of effects. It's not, so in this way, it doesn't substitute for a class. It's not an attempt to substitute a class analysis. It's an attempt to do cultural critique, basically.
I consider this cultural critique sociology, and that's pretty much it.
That's exactly what it is.
And I do agree with you. It's a benefit of this book that he doesn't try to go like, this explains everything about politics right now, a la Peter Turchin or Kristen Parenti, or, even our boy, our very dead boy, who's older than both of us, our spiritual forefather, Christopher Lasch, sometimes does this.
He sometimes does that, and his books where he does that less are better.
Right. This is why me and you, I think, have a penchant for early Lasch versus late Lasch, not because late Lasch is conservative, although, I mean, there's some conservative strains in there, but it's
just not as well argued because, but though Lasch, of course, does come up in this, and one of my questions is, do I get anything from most of this book that I don't get from reading Revolt of the Elites? Because that's really how I felt about the Rhetoric of Rising chapter, uh,
Mhm.
and then the Great Because Good chapter, linked to like a lot of late Lash stuff. So there's a number of themes, or even the culture of narcissism section on different like visions of success, Horatio Alger to the Happy Hooker.
Mhm.
Um, a lot reminded me of that. And those were not my favorite chapters of this book because I thought that he didn't really do a good job of explaining uh, the shift. I thought what was much better was once we got to credentialism, the last acceptable prejudice, and thereafter, which focused much more narrowly on how meritocracy has played out in its current rendition than how we got to a meritocratic system, which I don't think is as convincing of a tale uh, as his analysis of what it does now.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, well, let me, since we're jumping into that, we can talk about like the interesting distinctions. The one thing I could say I definitely get out of this book that you don't get from Revolt of the Elites, or actually any of the other books that we get. I mean, Catherine Lou's Virtue Hoarders, all this stuff. Is he thinks this is a near universal phenomenon because of credentialization, and that he finds it in similar attitudes relating to it, even in places like China.
Yeah,
My
that's a great point.
my pushback to that was he was extrapolating from his exposure to things in China, and I was like, yeah, but you are only exposed to elites in China
Yeah,
because
I
there is a lower number of students going well, lower per capita number of students going into universities in China. I mean, there's a lot, but it's not everybody. It's nowhere nearly as pushed as it is in the United States.
when I say a good point, mostly what I mean is, yeah, Lash doesn't attempt to do that. It's not
No.
it's a specifically American phenomenon in Lash's mind, which is not true anymore. You can see credential pattern voting in the UK, in most of Western Europe, um, and it's something which is a global phenomenon. I do think, though, that even if your exposure is limited to sections of the Chinese elite in
Mhm.
doing this analysis, the important thing about that is that the elite is increasingly cosmopolitan, not because of any conspiratorialism or anything like that, but because they're attending the same institutions, the same handful of institutions within the United States, and then going back to their own countries
Uh,
afterwards.
I mean, literally, there has been some attempt to kind of rein in the wild east of China's private education system, and right before COVID. And I actually think it's a good thing, even though I used to benefit from being downstream from that education system. Um, the the point he makes, I mean, even if you're not going to Harvard or Yale, which a lot of people are, like I made the observation just in my own life when I was working at these elite international schools, right? These IB schools. And they weren't prepping people to go to the United States. They were prepping people mostly to go to Europe and stuff. But that my students in those schools had liberal prejudices, watched liberal media, may even when they were conservatives, they were reacting to American liberal and conservative trends.
Yeah.
The moment I stepped out of that and even dealt with quote middle class people in Egypt or in Mexico, I had a completely different experience and a completely different set of assumptions. So for example, even middle schoolers at my that were from the Middle East and North Africa at the institution I taught at in Egypt basically parroted liberal talking points, but liberal middle class Egyptians who spoke English and had some Western education, but were not like from the elite system, had opinions that vastly were different than what you would expect, including like a kind of like liberalish argument for Trump because Trump is at least honest, unlike that traitor Obama who threw us under the bus. Like,
I think,
uh, you
yeah,
know,
One thing I've always thought is that often the extent of similarity between the opinions of elite elements of foreign populations and people in the United States seems to me defined by how closely their careers are expected to just be a response to developments in America. You start seeing this now happening in reverse as China has become more important. Like there's this Financial Times piece a little while back on how the executives of major banking institutions are expected to submit 2 essays a month on Xi Jinping thought, to do this cursory analysis of what's going on over there. It's a major market. And so I think that like the exportation of American cultural attitudes about merit or our particular relationship to elite institutions is replicated more cleanly in countries that do more business with us and have a closer security arrangement with us. Egypt is actually a country which does have a pretty close security arrangement with the U.S.
I mean, yes, the Camp David Accords means that, like, basically the military is paid for by the United States surplus.
But I think that the business arrangement is less direct than, say, like most of Europe or Japan or wherever, because there's not as much, financial linkage, basically, like in the markets. I mean,
the markets in Egypt are probably more clearly related to China. Like I remember Huawei and whatnot being on my radar much earlier than they are for people here, because one, I spent time in South Korea, and two, when I was in Africa, that was a major like brand that you saw. The China and Africa story is obviously one that is oversimplified in both directions. China doesn't tend to it's not doing like debt traps, particularly any worse than, say, the IMF. It is, however, less transparent, and that does breed resentment. And there's also middle class resentment at the Chinese in those countries, because China does not tend to train local workers when they build stuff. They tend to bring in workers. Yeah, it brings in its own workers, which is going to be a problem soon because they're going to have less and less workers to bring in. Yeah. But my whole point about that is just, I found that it was interesting that Sandel pivots. So, because China's a good example of this in particular. I don't think this merit culture has gone away in China, even though it's relatively new there. Even though I do not think we could say cleanly that China's is as Americo focused as it was even 4 years ago. I will also say that, and this is where liberal interventionists that I don't tend to agree politically with, but tend to think they are astute in analysis, to point out China's hitting a wall, and I think you're going to see some of this, which is not to say like China's about, as economy is about to collapse. I'm just saying like they're not growing as much anymore.
It has certain limitations which make the type of cultural exportation that comes with high levels of foreign investment less likely, in the near term, especially in farther away areas which are less immediately economically advantageous, like much of Africa, though not all of it.
So Sandel's interesting in the, if you want to read this under the Fareed Zakaria version of the multipolar world, not the weird Marxo-Duginist hybrid version.
That doesn't give you much, information, no matter what you're reading.
Right. But he's
go on. Sorry.
No, but he's on to something, because this is going to have an effect even if you see relative decoupling of the United States and China.
Yeah.
And it's also having effect in India, where you're seeing relative new coupling. There's a lot more focus on American relationships with India, and India as a rising economy.
That's true, but I actually have a different point about this, which is that one element of the meritocracy, which he doesn't focus so much on, is the immigration meritocracy, where as he talks a lot about, kind of similar to Lash's analysis or some of where Lash's essay on the talented 10th, basically his argument that meritocracy saps talented members of the lower classes and co-opts them into the ruling class.
Mhm.
And one thing which is true in a number of countries is that the way immigration is structured in the developed world, with most countries, though not necessarily the US, having a points-based, merit-based system for getting in, is it's a system which encourages brain drain from the developed world, the developing world, to give people a position in the developed world's meritocracy.
Yeah.
And maybe I
Good.
missed that if you talked about that at all.
No, I didn't. I've talked about it in other places. I don't think he talked about it in this book, and I don't think it came up. I mean, one of the things I've thought about a lot is that affects politics in weird ways.
Especially the relation between I mean, you have this this joke about Democratic uncles, Indian Democratic voters in Texas going to the voting booth to vote for Joe Biden and then home to send money to the BJP, stuff like
Right.
that. Or
Although, you go ahead.
you see this with Jewish voters and Israel, where Jewish voters are, by and large, one of the most left-wing groups in the country in terms of their voting habits, and on the diaspora of the Democratic Party on the relationship to Israel. So what it replicates is a relationship where there's liberal politics in the country that many of educated immigrants move to. I think less because they're immigrants and more because of the credential factor. But then their relationship to the country they came from is one where they tend to support even right-wing elements there.
Over time, this has an interesting dynamic, though, and I will call it, for lack of. I'm gonna be careful with this because there's a lot. I used to be in the paleoconservative world where this is almost an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but like the idea that there are a bunch of credentialed conservatives who, because of their actual conservativeness in their home country, eventually form a bloc here that really doesn't give a shit about domestic policy and is only focused on foreign policy, is kind of opportunistic on the domestic policy front from the crystals, etc., that you saw from the 70s to the 90s. One of the things that this pattern that you're pointing out, I think it's happening, and we're seeing it in real time. If you just look at the GOP candidacy and how GOP are trying to get a group of color on the stage, is you're seeing the factors of that liberal BJP weird alliance cut formally to a kind of Nikki Haley or Trumpist, depending on how they want to think how they think their alliance can go, kind of conservatism. And I hate to say it, but you need to study elite minority groups and the way credentialization plays into that for that role to be clear. But this brings me to one point I know you wanted to make, because we talked about it just before the show. This leads to a complete interesting lack in the analysis here of the U.S. working class, because everything I've seen recently, and this seems to be a trend for a while, everyone talks about independents and low information voters and blah, 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 but they don't want to link it to any class thing. The biggest group of independents in the country is people who make less than $50K a year.
Yeah.
And that is where racialized voting patterns
are strongest.
Right. Like, so the white working class doesn't tend to vote, but if it does vote, and if it's in a red state, it votes Republican.
Which it should be said is new. This is a post 2012 development, which people have to keep saying, because we tend to forget pretty easily.
I remember it just because I remember like Hillary Clinton trying to outdo Obama by doing the kind of thing that Hillary Clinton accused Bernie Sanders of doing in 2016. But anyway,
and then people of color who are working class, if they vote, they tend to vote for Democrats, though this is differentiated by specific ethnic group more often than not.
Right. So it's like 80% if you're Black. It's like
Typically higher for Black Americans, actually, like 90%.
Well,
not necessarily in 2024, but in the 2012 to
right.
like
Yeah, it's like 90%. That, although I was to say that there's weakening of that, and we're talking about different eras of stats here. But what I find fascinating about that is that's becoming gendered.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there's a different credentialization pattern in the African American community than other communities of color, which is just want to talk about that. Even more than the white population, African Americans tend to educate women. Now, there's all kinds of complicated reasons for that, including, the incarceration system, racial bias and policing. There's a ton of reasons for it.
But that's just the effect on.
That's the effect,
on the
and there's also probably some cultural stuff there that's actually pretty logical. There's some theories that this is based off the idea if you educate the mother, then no matter what happens to the father, you have a sound basis for raising of children, and that goes back to like Africa. I don't know that I buy.
Well, I think what I would say probably makes more sense to me is that in our credentialed world, a lot of working class jobs, which are primarily geared towards women, like being a nurse or being a teacher, does require higher education at this point, and a degree of some kind or another.
Labor aristocratic working class jobs that do not outpace inflation, but do lead to something like a living wage, and are the way out for women, as opposed to the way out for men.
Because there's a universal cultural opposition among men to like nursing or something,
right?
Which obviously doesn't make economic sense, but just is the way it's played out thus far in the history of American work, and maybe will change. Who knows?
Well, one of the things that I've been told by Utah administrators who are being more loose-lipped than they probably should have been, was that family wage assumptions actually still play a role in a lot of these fields. So there's just an assumption that there's another wage earner who is properly speaking middle class or upper middle class, because why else would you be educated and take a job that pays this low? I mean, other than people like me who are weird. And the assumption in the Black community has been, well, it's that or lumpenization. So what are you going to do?
Yeah. Though I do think another element is the changing demographics of who is in the Black community post 1965 immigration reform. And I haven't seen very much about this, but I will say that a large percentage of the people who get higher education are people whose families came here after 1965. So like something out of 4/5 or something like that of people who got into Harvard while affirmative action was going on. And it's not clear if they got in because of affirmative action or whatnot. This is just a good stat. We're Black people whose families came here post 1965 immigration rather than the descendants of American slaves.
Well,
what this is to say is just that another explanation of differing styles of credentialization and now changing voting patterns is the fact that an increasingly large percentage of Black Americans are members of some diaspora community or other, which goes into our earlier analysis of the voting patterns of recent immigrants.
So like the 3 to 5% of Black people in Salt Lake, almost all of them are either refugees or they're immigrants who came after 1980. And that's, it's not that there's no Black community here, but it has almost no relationship to the Southern Black community. Yeah. Or even people who've been free for a long time in the South. It's just, it's a completely different dynamic. The other thing
in the Midwest with like some, Somali immigrants, for example, Ilhan Omar.
We have, look at the Squad, for example, for this.
For an It's an indication that it's more complicated. Basically, what we're doing is a huge digression about the overridingly true point that we began with, which is that Sandel's explanation of the shift towards right-wing populist parties in large part is a resentment against and an opposition to the vision of credentialization and meritocracy as a way of organizing society. And he doesn't really have a good...
It's just racial.
It's true. It's just racial. So,
like it only really applies to white people. Like but it does make certain delusions that Democrats had until very recently a lot more rational, and it's also made. I know that I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I have said, "Hey, liberals, yes, the Great Replacement theory is the most weird, racist conspiracy theory that you can throw up. However, your way of talking from 2007 to about last year, which predates that conspiracy theory, makes it sound... I get where
it makes it sound more rational.
It makes it sound more rational than it actually even is. Like,
the claim is like there's a rising tide of people of color who are going to unite with the liberal elites and vote Democrat forever, and the Democrats played into that because they hoped it was true. Less because of immigration and more just because of demographic shifts among young people in the racialization of the population. But it turns out that's actually not the case.
right.
And that demographics is not destiny.
Basically, the whole prediction that everything's going to be hunky-dory by 2048, where we're minority. I'm like, well, by that point, half the Latin people are going to consider themselves white. Yeah. And do
you remember actually the map that was provided in that book?
Yeah,
it included it was permanent Democratic West Virginia. Yeah, so it just makes no sense. It's
right.
It's like Virginia it's like Colorado will stay red forever. West Virginia and Missouri are going to be safe Democratic states. And it's like, who made this? Do you have any understanding of your own argument?
Yeah. And so there's there's something very interesting about the meritocracy discussions that plays into Adolf Reed's critique of the racialized elite, which I pointed out against some of my, ADOS hating friends that African descendants of slave only stuff. Yes, the reparation scheme of that I don't think would work. I think it would read racial resentment out the wazoo, including and amongst Black people, but between immigrant and non-immigrant. There's all kinds of problems with that kind of politics. It's a disaster.
To get the Republicans a 90% vote in every election.
Right. And also it's just there is a moral case for it until you start thinking about how complicated demographics and histories really are, even amongst white people. Are we going to go okay, so we need reparations for the Scotch Irish who, while not had right privilege, were systemically forced out of certain kinds of ownership till the whole thing opens up a can of worms that if you really start getting consistent with it, there's no real people I can start to see. Are you comparing Scotch Irish indentured service slavery? No, I'm not bringing that up at all. And
it's just that they had a different relationship to American capitalism at the period when it utilized and exploited slave labor than other groups did.
Right.
And that's obvious. And there's
another complication to this though, in the racial narrative stuff. And it's the one where, and I've brought it up a lot recently, indigenous people, indigenous academics who speak for indigeneity all the time, overwhelmingly liberal.
Yeah.
Actual indigenous voting patterns of indigenous people, incredibly conservative.
Yeah.
And split politically, but that tends to be, interestingly, that's one of those
it's like there's a lot of block voting. You saw this with the failure of Heidi Heitkamp to I think it was her, the North Dakota Democrat, where she lost the support of the tribe and just lost a massive amount of support in the 2018 election. And that's one of the reasons she went down. My favorite fact about this is that Marty Robbins, of course, is Native American. And one of his songs one of my favorite of his songs, in fact, is called Ain't I Right? And it's about chasing socialist communists out of your town and like sending American politicians who are opposed to the Vietnam War to Vietnam. The first minority vice president was Charles Curtis, who was Native American, and I believe was maybe Calvin Coolidge or Warren Harding's
Yeah, he's from that period. And
from
he's
that
also
period.
one of those save the boy, kill the Indian people.
Yeah.
Like,
So I mean, it's
you know,
all this is to say, if in the voting patterns within minority groups, there's a very complicated situation, which seems to have less to do with credentialization than Sandel would ascribe it to.
right. It seems to be like, honestly, when you look at like indigenous voting patterns, it seems literally block voting based on immediate needs in rural communities, and that can go in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like, and right now, often does sincerely and for material reasons go Republican. So, you know, I guess this is our first caveat is like, hey, Sandel's talking about elite people, and by the way, if he's talking about elite people, he's talking about mostly white people because he's not looking at immigrants.
Yeah,
Like,
he's talking about elite people.
and maybe Asian people, but
Yeah.
like,
Or people who go to Harvard, which
right.
like that right there. It's mostly white people, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Asian people, and a smattering of other groups, some of whom are recent immigrants.
Right.
And then if he's talking about uncredentialed people, he's accurately characterizing the attitudes of most of the white lower and like lower middle class.
Right.
And that's useful, but it certainly doesn't capture the entirety of the story.
However, I will say that it looks like that is like I said to you, before we started, ironically, that means that this book may be more right in the future than it was when it was written. Because current patterns seem to be that the most consistently blue voting demographic of the financial wealth category, gray-haired coastal rich people who are not uber rich. So we're talking about more than the 1%. And actually, it gets weird because once you start getting into really high levels of money, you can start getting over $1 million. Like, it starts flipping back and forth wildly. Like, what?
Oh, then it's block voting based on industry,
Right?
or,
Exactly.
who your daughter or son has married.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What did your trust fund kid marry if you one of these people, one of the massive amounts of American bourgeoisie who have effectively opted out through investment structures from participating in civic life anymore? By the way, I would love one of these meritocracy people to start really looking at that shit because it's a massive thing.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things which made me become a socialist is going to private school, because I was like, this isn't a meritocracy,
remotely.
This is a great education I'm getting. My mom was a teacher there, or she still is. But a number of these kids are, really up on their high horse for something they did not earn. And it's going to continue happening.
So as a person who really believed in all that Ivy League, this is the irony about being a working class person who gets into higher ed significantly, is you have a tendency to believe that to believe all this meritocratic shit that Sandel's proposing. It's actually interesting that one of the ways to appeal to the working class to go into college is to lie to them about meritocracy.
I mean, I think it's also true that there are certain people who earn their place at the top. Like, it's
possible.
Like, I'm just saying, like, you can succeed by working hard, but most of the people at the top are succeeding by a mixture of working in general, sometimes hard, sometimes not, and the fortunate position which they found themselves in.
There's a mathematical study on this that I actually think is useful. Even if I assume that it's only 10% of your likelihood of being in an elite strata is because of your birth, and that 90% of it is merit, it still ends up that 10% is so still decisive that only 3 out of 10 people who make it into the upper echelons of anything will have earned it by work, which is a mathematical thing when you start thinking about it, because there's no way it's only 10% to set you up for that. So no, it's like,
I guess more my point is like the criticism of meritocracy, which I find most potent, is not of it as a moral desire to support people who strive and work hard. It's that it's an inaccurate way of describing our world as it exists.
Yeah.
And the effects of the world of meritocracy as it exists are manifestly undesirable and unfair, even at the things they promise to do.
Right. I mean, this is
not a moral condemnation to oppose. Well, no one deserves it, even the people who work hard. Like, the point is that this is a bad way of allocating things because it's so complex and it is so bad at rewarding the people who actually do work the hardest. In addition to the other, manifest effects of meritocracy.
Well, I'll give you an example of that. Like, one of the traits that I talk about when we talk about, and I don't know why we're so stuck on racial stuff, because I guess that's where
that's the biggest weakness of the book.
Right. But one of the things that actually is interesting about like the meritocracy game, right? We always think of like government workers where there's no meritocracy. One, as I pointed out,
the opposite.
Yeah, it's weirdly like if you do municipal or state work, you actually have more fiscal constraints than either private corporations do if they get venture capital, or anything involving the federal government. You actually do have to run a fairly lean, mean ship because you're publicly accountable and you can't print your own money. But also because like non-discrimination laws are actually taken seriously, which is not to say private corporations don't take them seriously, but they take them seriously defensively, right?
Yeah,
and there's all this back end stuff that I think the implicit bias racism shit definitely gets overstated, but this is one of those places where it's real, and thus really fucking matters. Private businesses often don't have nepotism rules, or if they do, they're like very specific. And the more elite you are, honestly, the less likely it is to apply. For example, even in academia, which is overseen by the government to some degree, I, as a high school teacher, have all these nepotism rules that unless I'm in a rural area where they just kind of waive them because they just don't have the workforce, is applied, right? By that I mean like I can't work in the direct chain of command with my spouse. In fact, if I'm in a lot of school districts, I can't work at the same school as my spouse, etc. I can't, family members can work together, but there's limits and okay, right? The Black community overwhelmingly, if it got credentialed and got into like nursing and where a lot of Black men went to was municipal work because
that too, yeah.
Well, because they actually do take the anti-discrimination laws and control for implicit bias inherently because they're afraid
that's implicit bias. That's explicit bias.
Well, yeah. Well, I think it's. I also think
it's not targeted racially. It's just targeted at your family, and friends.
Right.
Look like you do.
Positive explicit bias versus. So they take care of all that. But what's interesting is even in elite institutions in the public sector, that starts to break down. What I was getting to is like, there is no such thing as a spouse hire in public schools, right? Yeah. There is in elite international schools. There is, and and
then at the highest level, you have this where Mitch McConnell's wife was, Secretary of Transportation or something,
right?
And it's not like just a nepo hire, but jobs that they like help out they help each other out with. It's because the higher you go, the more likely it is that you're like just working with a small cadre of people you already know.
Well, but even, that's one example. But let's even look at elite institutions like the one you were talking about, private school. You go to a private elite university. One of the benefits of doing that is spousal hires.
Yeah, no,
It is. And what's weird is, like, originally spousal hires was kind of get more women PhDs in, and they wouldn't have. That's not. It doesn't seem to cut that way now. There's plenty of male spousal hires now. So but my comparison to that at a public school, like, that would be, we would freak out, like, if that ever happened at a public school, where in some ways, honestly, it has less effect.
Yeah, there were a number of people who were spousal hires at my maybe not just that, but certainly two people who were married who both worked at the school for my high school. Same thing for going to Cornell, same thing at Columbia Law now. Like, there's tons of people where it's like just overlap everywhere.
And that, by the way, it's not purely, I mentioned, like, some of this is actually from progressive policy. Some of this is also, like, there was the two-body problem, and people realize that means, like, oh, if you're, of course, academics spend most of their 20s and 30s in academic institutions, so they're likely to meet and fall in love with academics. No shit. Who else do they see other than students? And you definitely don't want them dating those. So, like, what happens then is, like, okay, well, now you have this thing, but you're both in a very limited field where there's very limited jobs. We're going to make an exception initially, but and that seems rational. Like, when I was getting my MFA, that even seemed like, well, that's a problem that we have, and it fucking sucks. And it wasn't that big a deal for me because my spouse was not, back when I was married, an academic. So I didn't worry about it. Like, she could probably get a job in whatever near where I went. And if she couldn't, I wouldn't go there. But for academics, I got it. And I get how that happened. However, that compounds over time in this problem where you have like family institutions like this.
This isn't, it should be said again, none of this is a moral condemnation. Like, if I was in a position where somebody was asking me, can you help me get a job here? And I thought they were remotely qualified, including a close member of my family, of course I'd do it. Everybody would. It's just that this means eventually you're in a position where elite institutions are not simply correlated to deservedness, which is what they say they are.
Right.
And it also is downstream of just a system where, more broadly, for much of the past 50 years, there have been a smaller and smaller number of jobs on which you can raise a family or even support yourself. And there's more and more reliance on these backdoor ways of getting entry to the few jobs which do pay well, or even the ones who don't.
When this does lead us to something that Sandel doesn't see because he is limiting himself, but that I do think I was reading Christian Parenti, and he was pointing this out, that one of the things that we have to look at is different from the first round of critiques of the professional manager and graduate sector versus the second round in the 90s versus now. All right. And it's interesting because I said this thing picked up and it was dropped in the 80s and 90s. Christopher Lash's Revolt of the Elites was one of the only ones that was not conservative, and we can go back and forth on that. But you and I both.
It's an introduction, basically, to a work of political economy he was planning on doing before dying.
Right. It's a big project. Blah blah blah.
It's kind of like how Haven is, like, on its own, like a book which is interesting but doesn't tell you a lot until you get to Culture of Narcissism and the Minimal Self, and then you're like, wow, this is a much bigger story than he was talking about then. This is a much bigger project.
Right.
Like or not his conclusions.
Right. I mean, what are the problems? I do love reading early Lash where he mocks socio-Freudianism for trying to over-explain everything through Freud.
He does that in the New Radicalism.
In the New Radicalism, like, right.
10 years later, he's like, I am a socio-Freudian, like,
right. It's just like,
and he's like, and I'm the best at it.
Yeah. And then, I think you and I go back and forth from this. He just drops it. Like, I don't mean he abandons it. It just gets dropped.
It's not a major theme, certainly, of Revolt. Though I think you can read the true and only heaven to have like some parts of what initially seems religious actually be just like washed up Freudianism. Like
Well, yeah.
that section where he's like, it's a deep gratitude for things early in our lived experience. This is the basis of hope. And like everybody's like, he's talking about the soul and God. And I'm like,
No, he's
yeah,
talking
he's
about
talking about the oceanic womb that he's talking about in the minimal self, and he's just dressed it up in new language. Like, you know, but anyway, this is beside the
this is
point.
beyond the scope. I mean, Sandel does not do this. But and one of the things that was actually refreshing about reading Sandel is it was more rigorous than your average dumb punditry book.
Definitely.
And this is where I was about to say, in the 90s, there was a conservative strain of this from the David Brooks crowd, like Bobo's in Paradise.
That book was funny. I read it.
Oh, it's hilarious. I enjoy it to like laugh at 90s liberals. However, it's also full of shit.
Yeah,
Like,
it's not a good critique. Like, I mean, if your like basis is of your book is a pun, you're usually not doing rigorous critique, I think.
Right. Although we should be careful. I mean, leftists should be careful, not me and you, but leftists should be careful of that because there's a lot of big critiques that are because they're dressed up in psychoanalysis or post-structuralism or neo-Marxism or whatever. And I don't mean neo-Marxism in the dumb way Jordan Peterson does. That people miss that the whole thing's basically a pun. Like I am currently writing a book called Wonktopia, which is about the Cass Sunstein rise and fall into what we see in liberalism now. And my first thing, as I say, this is an arbitrary thing that I am picking out to make a point that you should assume is not true. Like, it's just like, which is just funny because it's like, I really, unfortunately, think leftists should start stating that our paradigms aren't real. They are just a way to get you to see something. But anyway, this book is interesting because it reads kind of like one of those punditry books in that it is full of headlines from the late out teens.
It looks like one too. I'm going to show this off.
Yeah,
you would buy this in an airport.
It is very much an airport book design, and yet it is way more rigorous than that.
Yes.
It's easy to read, and I think that also kind of throws people off because people are used to working through shit that's very difficult to read to get like minimal stuff. This is all pretty directly stated.
It's very direct, but it also like is really rigorous research. You know, it's not vast. It misses a lot, but it's not like one of those books that you flip through and it's like one citation per page.
No, there's tons.
There's tons of citations. It's clear this guy did his research. So, you know, if you're in an airport, I would recommend anybody, you know, pick it up. If you're not, don't go out of your way. That's my attitude. That's a joke.
Well, here my thing about this book is like Yasha Monk right now, his student is doing this with the ID, and I like there's a whole strain of like lefty liberally thinkers like Sandel, including his doctoral advisor, the communitarian Charles Taylor, who he kind of rejects for being too soft in capitalism and liberalism. And then Yasha Monk, who I think is the dumb version of this. Not that Yasha Monk is dumb, I mean he's not, but like I've read his new ID poll.
He's not as thorough as Sandel is.
No, and it's also very, you know, and Sandel's interesting. I mean, Sandel caught, you know, Sandel's had an effect on liberal jurisprudence, even though he's not a liberal, because his student, Ketanji Brown Jackson, is on the Supreme Court. So, I mean, he is, how much did his, like left communitarian republicanism affect Ketanji Brown Jackson? I don't think a lot. I haven't read any enough of her rulings to say for sure, but having read them so far, I don't see a lot of like communitarian like public asset building thought going on in what she's doing. And I mean, Sandel's interesting too because he's a political philosopher in a law school, which is something that means that he is very much working in a real applied tradition.
like Vermeulen. No, I'm
Yeah.
joking.
No, I mean,
Vermeulen is
actually,
mostly a legal scholar, but he's a similar breed in terms of his public attitudes.
well, I was about to say, all the other people I think that are like this who aren't this communitarian strain that I'm talking about, almost all of them are conservative political philosophers.
Yeah.
Either of the Vermeulen, Deneen,
Like
national conservative,
crap.
post-liberal school, or of the neoconservative, like Hamofarb and Irving Kristol and that school, like Stanley Rosen, people like that. And a lot of my audience who's mostly used to left references are like, who the hell are you talking about?
Example of this is actually Noam Chomsky, but he's not he's not producing anything at the moment.
And, yeah, and I mean, yes, and also what he taught in and what he theorized politically were like very separate.
Yeah.
Which is not true for Sandel. It's not true for the conservative versions of this, like Vermeulen and Deneen. But Sandel's interesting because, in some ways, he is predicting and responding to the Vermeulens and Deneens, and also the Cass Sunsteins of the world. He doesn't see
Cass Sunstein favorably, I think.
Right. And actually, that's my critique of this book, is there's part of him who does still believe
that workerist protectionism, anti-immigrationism can fix it.
But yeah, I think he thinks that, well, basically he's a corporatist in the same way that Deneen and Vermeulen are, but with more left-wing politics.
Yeah. I mean, I think like the basic conclusion you come to from that perspective is that the most vital thing is a refocusing on national sovereignty, because internationalism, or not internationalism, but in international politics in its current form, is typically a globalized deference to technocratic institutions abroad.
Right.
Which is true.
And you could definitely see someone like these neo-MMTers glomming onto Sandel because they all they like to believe we're already in that world.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that certain elements of economic analysis point to not economic nationalism, but a focus on the national economy over the international economy being something that could be potent and improve the living standards and the politics of, say, the United States. But it's insufficient, and it misses a lot of the point of how we got here, and also doesn't really offer a way out or answer the most pressing issues, which are like global development, climate change, things which are not a matter of simply repoliticizing the nation into a nation-building project.
Right.
A domestic nation-building project, I should say.
Right. And I also don't think, I think you're absolutely right. I think both the left and the right have abandoned the kinds of things you need to look at to have a non-eliminationist nation-building project.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the smarter, for example, people who are on the left and study finance are thinking of finance as a tool for global development, not a tool for, additional sovereignty, because we have sufficient sovereignty within the financial system to do whatever we need to do, in terms of monetary policy, not fiscal policy necessarily. But the point of this is just to say, like, it's not a panacea to our attitudes or a cultural problem, which Sandel identifies, to simply do tariffs and build factories here.
Right. I mean, because the reason why I point out this corporatism, because this is where Sandel is different from us, or at least me, in that.
Oof, backhanded. No, I'm joking.
In that, I think class collaborationism is always, under this system in particular, doomed. And I hate to be all Benjamin Studebaker-y on things, but I'm going to be all Benjamin Studebaker-y. For those who listen to the Corrupted interview on that, we talked about this. Capital flight, yes, you can theoretically pump money into it to prevent capital flight from the monetary policy, maybe in the fiscal policy if you really like rearrange some law.
Sure.
The problem that you have with that is that the power dynamics internally are not fundamentally changed by doing just that.
Yeah.
And because of that, you are still at risk of capital flight in different ways than you would think. So what do I mean? Well, no, a lot of these companies aren't going to leave the biggest market in the world, but they might leave your state and fuck your individual senator, and thus that's never going to be able to go through.
Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true.
And I don't think Sandel's vision for this, like when I read this, I was reading this book to talk to you about it, and I had just gotten through Studebaker's book for an interview. And I was just like, Studebaker would just hit Sandel with a wall. Like, there's no way.
Yeah. I mean, Sandel he's not calling, for example, for establishing like public companies in like the rural Midwest or something,
Right.
like something which has greater constraints on capital flight of the type you're talking about, which is certainly more probably going to be more frequent in era of reshoring. Not even as a matter of government policy, but also based on energy costs. Like compare the energy costs in California to those in the South, or deferring labor laws. Like the point of this is that it replicates the dynamics of globalization, the most unhelpful ones internally. Yeah. And there's no real means of addressing this beyond making it so that the projects that, like the Biden green policy, for example, embarks on are so large in these targeted areas that it's economically unadvantageous to move them in the immediate term. But we're not talking 50 years out. And if you're talking about, cultural reform, which is basically what Sandel is talking about, you have to be planning for the next 70 years. You have to be planning on a generational level, not just on the immediate level of returning jobs to a particular area now.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. This brings us to, and we're going to wrap up this part one. And I think we're going to go more into the specific argument he makes with the book. Why I'm frustrated, even though I've talked about how great this book is, it is great, but I'm frustrated with his story for how this happened being so limited, necessarily because of what he's choosing to write about.
Decisions within, like, the Harvard presidency, basically.
Right, because, like, who gives a shit, really? Like,
it tells you why they didn't expand. It doesn't tell you much more.
Right. And like the expansion of these institutions would not have fixed these larger scale problems. And that's
well, he admits that, but he's like, that's why his solutions seem to offer ways to undercut the vision of meritocracy rather than even undercutting the effect of producing an elite. It's just that this elite would be recognized as more circumstantial than our current elite.
Right. Whereas I guess when we talk about the substance of this in the next episode, I want to think about this in a couple of ways. One, most of these people still see the working class as a relatively static force. That has been in so many of these books. That has been an assumption. Sandel's interesting because he doesn't think that they have to be, unlike, say, Turchin, who just doesn't factor them in at all, ever, anytime in history, period. But he also doesn't seem to think that, that there's a real way to revision, like, to get away with this class. And when I say this, I don't mean get away with the need for experts. I got asked a weird question, like, would the militia have special services? And I was like, do workers have specializations?
Or police procedurals, obviously,
Right. I was just like, do workers have specializations? What when you think about that, ask yourself a question about like,
will you be a member of the SWAT team under socialism?
well, it's not even.
No, I'm
I mean,
just joking.
I know that's a joke, but I mean in a more serious way, because I talk about like
Yeah.
what class in a deeper sense, and just like in a sense that most socialists won't go to, because it implies like eventually getting rid of states for government functions and stuff like that. Where I'm like, the problem is the fungibility of resources and the non-fungibility of positions. And that's an interesting thing to talk about. But by the fact, like, there's nothing, I think, like, even in a anarchisty system that was functional, if such a thing existed, there would be specializations and differences in people, because there's just fucking specializations and differences in people naturally. But the differences in a system where there's relative power egalitarianism, which is, you know, would by necessarily be a class of society. If they fuck up, you can recall them in a way that makes them much more accountable to everyone in the group. And I don't see anything like a plan for that coming out of Sandel. I see a plan for like, well, we just need to like we need to turn against the liberal internationalism, have a left-wing nationalism. But, you know, like, you know, the when you mentioned Vermeulen and Deneen, I'm like, it is amazing how much Sandel agrees with Vermeulen and Deneen. He's just he doesn't think like a Catholic theocracy would be great for the country,
Yeah.
or viable as a basis for a civic republic.
I'm in complete agreement with that perspective from him.
Right. But if you were to like take him and someone who doesn't go as far as Vermeulen and Deneen, but goes almost as far, like Sohrab Ahmari.
Well, he mentioned Rob favorably in this.
I know he does. So you sort of see like where this goes. Whereas I just think this corporatist stuff, because it actually still naturalizes a lot of these power dynamics. It doesn't really look at how they develop long term. It talks about the stuff that we were talking about. Yeah, this is accidental. It comes out of well-meaning, even progressive policy. And this is one thing you and I both talk about. Maybe we get it from Lash. I get it from having been a conservative for a while, then never totally abandoned this. That the conservative critique of unforeseen consequences is something that the left really needs to get through.
Read more James C. Scott, everyone.
Yeah. That like this stuff has feedback loops. You really gotta think about it. And a lot of them, and you can't predict all of them, but you have to be able to pivot to deal with them. And we built like, there's still, even amongst the relative far left in culture, a love of institutions in a like someone like this the Conspirituality podcast. I've been listening to lots of my mind a lot these days. They'll be like, well, you know, there's a lot of good reasons why people have turned anti-elite because of neoliberalism, capitalism, etc. But they still actually accept the elite institutions on their face value in a way that I'm just like...
You see this in the places where the protests against the Israeli response in Gaza have been most discussed. It's people protesting against their colleges. Not like just on the colleges. They're protesting against the college, which, you know, like if you're asking for divestment, like there's good reasons for that. But it's a targeting at an institution that they think could be utilized to change things in a way which misunderstands the relative importance of that institution in prolonging the status quo, you know?
Right. Hence why affirmative action like diversified the elites and changed very little for poor Black people. Like it's something that I think we have to really look at. And I wanted to go into the merits of this book and the demerits before we went into the specifics, because I also think some of those demerits, like not looking at immigration patterns, it not really looking at it, seemingly is so focused on elite that it's basically focused on white, Asian, and Jewish people. Like it's not
focused on the credentialed classes, who I think it should be added also have much less of an influence over society than maybe Sandel attributes to them.
Well, I mean,
Like,
there is a
not,
narcissism of the PMC
yeah,
fighters within the PMC.
it's
Like,
not that, like, if the elite was truly as powerful and respected as maybe they think they are, though I don't think post-Trump they think they are in the same way, or as Sandel's book would suggest, Democrats would win like 80% of the vote in every election, and our country would like look like California everywhere.
right, which would be a disaster, but it
Yeah.
would be a disaster.
That's why I said California rather than New York. This country could do with a little more of a New York attitude, let's say.
Yeah.
But anyway, like the point is that there are segments of the elite.
I definitely prefer East Coast liberal elites over West Coast liberal elites. That's all I'm going to say.
So good, so true. Point is that elites are not wholly defined by credentials. They're in fact much more defined in terms of their effect on the world and their power by the jobs they're in, how much money they make, their position within industry. And agribusiness, for example, has massive influence over the country. And it's not like a cast of Henry Wallace style agronomists. It's like dudes who own like tens of thousands of acres of land or something. It's just a very different way of, it's a different style of elite than that which is felt most pertinently in major cities.
Right, which this gets to my other point about when you go up in the higher echelons, this whole like, okay, the predictors under 100K racialized, slightly more democratic leaning just because of urbanization, and way more independent, particularly amongst white people, but even in Latin people, etc. Over 100K likely to be Republican. Over 250K likely to be super likely to be Democratic. There is a way where I tell people like Joe Biden and Dianne Feinstein do represent a significant block in their party's voting base, not just in their leadership class.
Yeah.
And then over 500K, a million K, you get into the Wild West in that it's block voting based on industry, and it's going to be predicted by regional industry.
Yeah,
it is not going to be predicted
or just
by,
region, in fact, for people who are not wealthy because of industry.
Right. Or it's personal affiliation, cultural affiliation, etc. When we talk about like heiresses of trust funds, like
Romney Clinton voters,
right. This world is harder. That world's actually weirdly harder to predict in a way that also complicates their narrative, because there is sort of like, well, why aren't all the super rich Democrats then if it's that simple? And the answer goes, well, not all the elites are actually that credentialed.
Yeah. And why is there that working class resentment against like agribusiness or something,
Right.
Which there is.
It's just
that it's not reflected by voting patterns.
Right. I was about to say, like, the small farmer suicide thing was like, it is aimed at and small farmers are like 1% of the population or less, but like it's aimed at elite agribusiness and government policy, but it doesn't cut in a clearly partisan way. Because that's a strange mixture of like the 2 or 3 old conservative families who still do small farming, are weird libertarian startups, or like leftists who want to do farming co-ops who do boutique farming and still end up having charged a lot for it. That's like a very, like, yes, they're mad at agribusiness, but it doesn't cut in a partisan way. And to make it even more problematic, it also doesn't have a mass base anywhere. Yes. Because we're talking about relatively small parts of the U.S. population. It's also why, for example, like the actual politics of indigenous people doesn't really get reflected in our discourse about indigenous people, because they're 3% of the population. Absolute proof of genocide, but it's hard to build a coalition out of that.
Yeah.
And so these are things that, like, if you are a a relatively reformist socialist like yourself, or a fire and brimstone socialist like myself, who is not sure that this is ever going to be reformable. The issue that we have is that we often actually read the entire political landscape in the way that these liberals do, which are defined by elite institutions and even certain kinds of anti-liberalism, whether it's this left communitarianism of Sandel or the right communitarianism of Vimule, Deneen, and Emery. That's still a relatively elite discourse.
Yeah.
Like,
being a member of the center right of the far left has its limitations.
Well, yeah. And one of the things that when I talk to like working people, even like strike discourse right now, which definitely affects workers, really isn't bleeding out into middle-aged workers that much. It's just not. Unless you're in an industry where it's actively happening, in which case, yes, it is. But it's not like.
But those are a very small percentage of industries, you know.
Right. And so you hear of this current narrative about like, oh, yay, we are in this moment of like labor revitalization. And a lot of workers hear it and go like, what are you fucking talking about? And that's because even the anti-meritocratic discourse is rooted in these institutions and actually assumes this meritocracy has more effect on people's lives than it probably actually does.
I mean, it's much easier to write pieces about large institutions than like the myriad small institutions that define most people's lives.
Right. Which
easier to understand the UAW than all auto repair shops in the country.
Right. Well, yeah. This is something that I keep pointing out, but it's a major blind spot right now because we are telling ourselves a narrative that is actually weirdly based on this meritocratic narrative, even though it's a counter to it. And Sandel's an example of that, and we're going to talk about that in our next episode. And maybe, what he gets right, what he gets wrong, and more specific. But we do it too all the time. And it's like the number of times in the last 10 years that I'm like, we're seeing a labor resurgence. And I'm like, yes, we are. And yet I don't know what it means. And I don't think it means what you think it means because you are viewing this from a very particular lens in a very particular sector. And you're right. Also, large institutions, it's also easier to just organize. There's a reason why we've shifted from the UAW doing stuff to other stuff, and then still not talked about hey guys, how much of the economy can be revitalized amongst workers' unions on the industrial scale, right? The UAW, and the answer is about 12%.
Yeah,
it's not.
I mean, it's a matter also of labor law is still geared towards the situation that existed in the 1970s when there was the last major reform to labor law.
Yeah, which allowed
minor reform in the 70s.
And that was to allow public sector workers to unionize, which then became the only thing that really is still unionized outside of manufacturing. But on that depressing note, we will come back to this, Elijah. So I'm going to end us here. Thank you for coming on, and you will be back to talk more about Sandel in detail very soon.
Thanks for having me.